Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives, our jobs, our incomes, our debts, and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I'm hoping that gave me the skill to make some useful comments on the economy we all live in and depend on in terms of what has recently happened. Before beginning today, I want to draw your attention to an important annual event. It is the conference of the year for people who are engaged in efforts to change society, to make this world a better place. These are folks who are concerned about ecology, concerned about poverty, concerned about a whole host of social issues that we know are important to make this world a better place. They're about half academics and half activists, and their job is to talk publicly to one another and to an engaged audience. And they do that at something called the Left Forum. It will meet this year, as it has in recent years, at the John Jay College of the City University of New York. That's in downtown, midtown Manhattan. The times of the meeting, June 1 through June 3. It will be opened on Friday, June 1, with an address from a number of people, including Jane Sanders. If you are interested in participating, in having these discussions, in learning what these folks are doing, this is your chance to do that. And you can find out all the details, even information about the 300-plus panels they will have, by going to their website, leftforum.org. I urge you to take a look. I also want to give credit before jumping in today to one of our listeners and viewers, Michael McGahey. It was his message to us asking about the Mitbestimmung in Germany that led me a few weeks ago to talk briefly about it to you. And there was quite a reaction. So in addition to thanking Michael, I wanted to remind you again what it is. In Germany, Mitbestimmung, which roughly translates into codetermination, is the law, has been the law for decades in Germany. Every enterprise with more than 2,000 workers must have an annual election where little less than half the board of directors of the company is elected by the workers to make sure that the workers have their own representatives on the decision-making board of directors. In companies with less than 2,000 but more than 50, 1/3 of the board has to be elected in this way. Workers participate in the decision-making apparatus in one of the most successful capitalist economies in the world. It might lead you to wonder why other countries, trying to be as successful as the German, haven't found that particular part of their success worth emulating. Let me turn now to the updates of recent weeks. Perhaps the most important change in the labor mood in the United States has been the wave of strikes by public school teachers. Started in West Virginia, but has now spread to Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, and beyond. I want to make sure everyone understands that in some of these cases, unions were important in getting these successful strikes going. But in other parts, the workers did it on their own, without unions. They have been stunningly successful. They have organized brilliantly. They have overcome divisions among the teachers, those in rural areas versus those in urban, those who are registered Democrats and those who are registered Republicans, and so on. They did this in order to get together to do something fundamental, raise their wages and salaries to an acceptable level, and get the schools that they've given their lives to the funding necessary to educate this generation of children. They've made both those demands central to their struggles. As little as a year ago, in March 2017, Bernie Sanders and Danny Glover led a march of thousands of people into the South to support an effort to organize the auto workers at the Nissan factory. That effort did not succeed. The union effort was defeated. And here we are, literally a year later, and the situation has changed dramatically. Unionizing efforts, strike efforts, efforts to improve not just the wages workers get, but the working conditions that allow them to serve the public, have been radically improved. What a difference a short amount of time can make, and no one should miss the changing political and economic winds in our society. My next update has to do with a particular company and the lesson it teaches. The company's name is Theranos, Theranos. It was a company that burst onto the public awareness a few years ago because it promised, or more exactly the CEO, Elizabeth Holmes, promised that she and her scientists had developed a new, quick, and efficient way of doing blood tests on people to discover problems that they had, diseases they needed to attend to, and so on. It would revolutionize the medical industry, she said. By 2013, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Well, all of that came crashing down as it was determined that the promises were either incorrect, uninformed, or fraudulent. Depends a little bit on your point of view. Investors have lost $900 million that were poured into that company. The investors who thought that the hype was correct included the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul, Betsy DeVos, the current Secretary of Education, and others. So much for the claim that these super rich people are super smart when it comes to investments. In this case, not so much. Elizabeth Holmes has been found by the Securities and Exchange Commission and others to have behaved inappropriately. She is banned from serving as a leader of a company for 10 years. She's barred and has to pay a $500,000 fine. But given the size of the company, given the wealth of the investors, $500,000 paid by Elizabeth Holmes is trivial relative to the wealth this gambit won for her. Likewise, the investments of the Waltons, Murdoch, and DeVos are tiny fractions of their wealth and will mean nothing to them. So where is the risk in this capitalist venture gone bad? Well, as usual, the real risk, not the one you hear about. You'll hear about the risk of investing and not getting your money back, the risk of a new scientific breakthrough that turns out not to be what it hopes and claims to be. Those are the risks you'll hear about. But here's the one you won't hear about, and it's the biggest risk of all. At its peak, Theranos had 800 employees. That's 800 families dependent in every way on the income generated in the livelihoods of those 800 people. Currently, the number of employees is 15. That's right. Out of 800, 785 have gotten fired. If they bought a home and took out a mortgage based on the income they got from that company, those are in danger. if they moved their children to a new community, enrolled them in a high school that is now a central part of those teenagers' lives, they'll have to move now because their folks lost the job. You know, the risk taken by a worker when he or she enrolls in a company is just as powerful, if not more so, in their lives as the risk of the entrepreneur and the risk of the investor. Unless the investor is even more stupid than these folks were, they will spread their investments. It's known as not putting all your eggs in one basket. You put a little of your wealth into this investment, a little into that one, precisely so if something goes bad, you're not going to be basically affected. And that's the case with the Waltons and the Murdochs and the Betsy DeVoses, as it is with most well-advised investors. But the worker has no such option. The worker depends on his or her income from his or her work. And if the capitalist in question, Elizabeth Holmes in Theranos, is either crooked or incompetent, the ones who lose the most, who've taken the biggest risk, are those workers. And yet their risk is disregarded. They can't say that their pay should not only be pay for the work they do, but also pay for the risk they take. No, in our strange culture, we imagine risk is something only undertaken by those who have money. My next update has to do with an interesting point made by one of you in communicating to us through our websites, as we will, as always, invite you shortly to do. You asked, are we perhaps in another Gilded Age? And so let me explain, and I'm glad to do this, what the phrase Gilded Age means. It was actually first used, I believe, by the famous American author Mark Twain, who wrote a novel called The Gilded Age. And this phrase came to describe roughly the period from 1870 to World War I, roughly half a century, during which some of the greatest fortunes of the wealthiest Americans came to be. You know, names like Carnegie and Rockefeller and so on. It was a time of enormous growth in American wealth, coupled with unspeakable poverty across America at the same time. It was called the Gilded Age to suggest, as Mark Twain did, that yes, at the top, what we nowadays might call the 1%, it was glitz, it was money, it was wealth. But right below it was a mass of seething immigrants living in really broken down ghettos in our major cities. It was time of some of the bloodiest strikes and labor disputes, the Pullman strike, many of the others. It was a time of abject poverty, corrupt political machines. And so the questioner who wrote to me said, could we be in another moment that deserves the phrase Gilded Age? Very good question, and my answer is yes, exactly. Just only this thought. We need another great novelist, another person like Mark Twain, to come up with the right phrase that captures the growing gap between the 1% and the rest of us. It's very necessary. Let me interrupt for a moment by reminding you that we maintain two websites that I urge you to make use of. We fill them with materials for you. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is absolutely no charge for using them. One of them is rdwolff with 2fs.com. And the other one is Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. Through these websites, you can communicate to us what you like and don't about this program, what you'd like to see us cover. Through those websites, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, which we urge you to do as a way of partnering with everything that this program seeks to achieve. The websites are also ways for you to see the range of work we do, to get more information than what we can do, to follow us on the variety of services we now provide. We have a store with interesting products that may be of interest to you. We have a blog you can follow. We have ways for you to sponsor us. Please make an effort to take a look at our websites and make use of them. That's why we maintain them literally every day. Recently, in a report from CNN, it was indicated that banks and non-banks, who are becoming more important in the mortgage business, are lending less and less to wealthy and middle-income Americans, and more to those at the rich end of the spectrum. I want to mention this only to drive home the point that the so-called recovery since the crash of 2008 has been very, very unequal and unfair, something which the American people clearly seem to understand. And just another piece of the evidence, this shifting of money for homes going to where the wealth is and leaving the communities of the poor and the communities of the middle. The folks who suffered most in the crash of 2008 are now being discriminated against because it's not as profitable to lend to them as to others. That's not a recovery, folks. That's a deterioration of the situation of most Americans continuing from their disproportionate suffering during the crash of 2008. I want to turn in the time that remains to me to two major events of the last week. One of them was the announcement by President Trump of what he's proposing to do to deal with the awful high prices of drugs and medicines here in the United States. The bottom line is, after his speech was over, the prices of the stocks of companies that make drugs and medicines zoomed up. Clearly, the companies and the investors in them understood what I'm about to tell you, that Mr. Trump's proposals will do next to nothing to control and limit the prices of drugs and medicines we all depend on. And why not? Well, everybody who follows this knows that there are two big ways that many people have advocated to lower drug prices. The first is allowing Medicare and Medicaid to negotiate with the drug companies to buy medicines in huge bulk and thereby get them at a lower price. Let me remind you that we Americans pay more for medicines than nearly everyone else in the world. And that leads me to the second way we can lower prices, namely by allowing Americans easily to buy medicines from abroad. Many Americans already do that in both Canada and Mexico. If you live near those borders, you know what I'm talking about. But Mr. Trump's speech did neither of those. Not a word about buying drugs in bulk to lower the price, and not a word about allowing Americans to buy what are often the exact same drug made by the exact same company from another country at a much lower price. These two steps would, of course, drive down the price of drugs in the United States so they look more like the drug prices in other countries. Instead of doing any of those things that would really make a difference, what Mr. Trump did was yell at countries, for example, the European countries, with the following bizarre argument. Drug prices are too low, he said, in those countries. They should be higher. And here was his argument. Those countries drive a good bargain with the medical and drug companies, those countries do, to get those low prices. And what that makes those companies do is jack up the prices in the United States to make the big profits that they are blocked from making in other countries. Let me translate that bizarre argument. Mr. Trump is saying that foreigners are better deal makers with drug companies than Americans have been. Gee, that's an insult to Americans, isn't it? And it's a real slap on the back to the sharp deal makers everywhere else in the world. If you doubt that, me too. This is a way to get out of the blame by finding a foreigner to blame. It's right up there with blaming immigrants for the problem of American workers. Blaming foreigners is just what Mr. Trump's Make America Great Again amounts to, and it always has. And by the way, don't be surprised. Mr. Trump's failed effort to rein in drug prices follows the equally failed effort of Mr. Obama to get that job done, which followed the equally failed effort of Mrs. Clinton during the reign of Bill Clinton to get that job done. Somehow our leading politicians run for office promising to do something about the bad drug prices, and then somewhere along the way, the lobbyists for those companies bring it all to nothing. No wonder the prices of the stocks went up. They knew what was going on. The other big event this last week, also of course, from Mr. Trump, was the decision by Mr. Trump and his advisors to break the treaty with Iran, or to be more careful, to break a treaty signed not only by the United States and Iran, but by 5 other countries: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China. So all those countries signed a treaty. And last week, the American government broke the treaty. Now, they couldn't be honest and say broke, because that doesn't sound good, does it? So they say, or Mr. Trump said, we are withdrawing. I suppose that was designed to fool somebody. Breaking a treaty is a remarkable thing to do. Keep it in mind the next time you hear about other countries breaking treaties. And let's remember, the reasons given by Mr. Trump were that we didn't get enough out of this, namely the Iranian commitment to stop developing their nuclear program. For your information, if it hasn't been made clear to you, every one of the other 5 countries that signed on to this treaty, Germany, France, Britain, China, and Russia, have declared that in their judgment, Iran has observed its side of the bargain. The United States' claim to the contrary, they reject every single one of them. So the United States' decision to withdraw is what? It's probably got very little to do with anything about the Iranians not performing their side of the bargain, since everybody else thinks they have, and there's international inspection all the time to verify. Well, what else could be the reason then? The answer is, it makes Mr. Trump look like a tough guy, somebody protecting America and whacking the evildoers over there in another Muslim country. But I'm an economist, so I'm interested in the economic effects of what Mr. Trump has done to build up his domestic reputation with his political base. And I'm just going to give you a few. Here we go. 1, how in the world are you going to strike a deal with the North Koreans when you meet with them in a month, a deal in which we promise them to give them economic assistance if they diminish their military nuclear program. They've just observed us break that deal for our own reasons. Why would they make such a deal? Why are you doing this, and especially now? Let me give you another example of an economic effect. Just a few weeks ago, the Boeing Aircraft Company signed a deal to sell $20 billion worth of super airliners to Iran. That's a lot of work for thousands of employees of the Boeing Aircraft Company. Kiss that goodbye, because the Iranians are not going to be able to buy those things. In fact, the Trump administration has already said it's canceling the alliances. Who's going to be hurt by this? The Europeans have invested heavily in Iran. So have American companies. All of those investments are threatened by all of this. Indeed, the United States is threatening to punish companies in Europe that do business in Iran as part of reimposing the sanctions now that the United States has withdrawn. Let me ask you, dear listener, dear viewer, how would you feel as an American if some foreign dispute, say between India and China, or between, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, and in the dispute between those two countries, they decided to punish by fining or otherwise hurting American companies that did business with the other side? You'd feel outraged, wouldn't you? Well, how do you think companies around the world feel? And if indeed this continues, all we are doing is making the Iranian oil, they're one of the greatest producers of oil and gas in the world, go elsewhere in the world, work out their payments with the Chinese, who are already their biggest customer, get further distanced from us, may indeed renew their nuclear program, who knows? This is an enormous political and economic disaster undertaken to boost the political fortunes of a minority president who's desperate to have more support. And we ought to wonder about a society that permits such a thing. We've come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. I want to thank you for being with us. Please stay with us after a short break. We will be here with the second half.